Welcome to our final session in our SOS Couples course, session number 7. And the goal here today is to go ahead and finish the book of the Song of Songs. We've got just the final chunk left in the book, and there's a lot of, again, practical things here for our learning. I trust this has been a helpful course, the purpose of which is, of course, to give you some teaching, to give you some tangible homework assignments so that you can start working through some of these things as a couple, to start addressing some of these issues and just getting honest. The main goal is to try and reestablish communication between you as a couple. It's amazing that, as they often say, so different scholars and resources and surveys often say that the top issues in marriage are always communication, finance, children, child care, rearing, disagreements over that, and your sex life. And out of those 4 things, I've always argued that the biggest problem is communication. Because if you don't have communication, you're not going to fix any of the other problems. But if you have good communication, if you'll sit down and talk to each other in a civil manner and work through things, then all the other issues can get worked through. It's just a matter of time and working through it. But my main primary goal is to get you guys sitting down and talking, to address some of these issues. And so I trust that this has been a blessing as you work through these big ideas. Now, let me just remind you where we left off last time and what we're going to do to pick up the story here today. Now, if you're with us last time, we got through a pretty good chunk of the book, chapter 5, verse 9 to chapter 7 and verse 10. What we saw were these 3 big ideas. And when it comes to the idea of really trying to rebuild their relationship, because you had the major fight, right, that takes place in chapter 5, and that is rooted, the root of their marriage conflict is rooted in disappointed expectations. And yet, as they came to these steps that you see there on the screen, they were able to rebuild their relationship. Number 1, Shulamite regained respect for Solomon. Number 2, Solomon reaffirmed his love for Shulamite. And then those actions brought about a rekindling, number 3, of their intimacy. And the hottest sex scene in the book is chapter 6:11 to 7:10. And that scene is incredibly practical for us to give us some tools to help us learn to rebuild our marriage. Well, what I want to look at today is the last part of the book. We're going to pick up the story in chapter 7, verse 11, and we're going to work our way all the way through to chapter 8 and verse 14. We're going to finish the book here today. This is what we're going to see. 2 big ideas that I want to camp on. First of all, I want to talk about renewing your pursuit. Renewing your pursuit of one another as a couple. In other words, we're going to talk about not just rebuilding your marriage. That was last session. But now I want to talk about renewing your pursuit. In other words, now that you are in the process of rebuilding your marriage, let's keep that going. Don't stop. Don't take your foot off the gas. You keep forging forward in your relationship. You build upon the progress that you're making. You renew the process of pursuit. We'll explain that. But then we'll see the last section of the book, chapter 8, verses 5 to 14, is all about resting in acceptance. Resting in acceptance. And the idea is that the ultimate goal is to achieve marital security, where you don't wake up every morning wondering if your spouse is going to love you that day or leave you that day, or how your spouse is going to treat you that day. But you can be secure in the fact that, you know what, we're not perfect. We're going to have problems. We're going to have to talk through some things. We're going to have to continue working these principles out in our marriage throughout the rest of our marriage. But we love each other. We're not going to leave each other. We're going to get through this. And that sort of acceptance and love that you can share towards one another is a tremendous source of security. And it helps. We want to get to that point. That's the ultimate goal in our marriages. We want to get to that point where we're resting in acceptance in our relationships. All right? So, with that said, let's begin by reading this section, chapter 7, verse 11 to chapter 8, verse 4. And what you're going to see is that it's going to be very reminiscent. It's going to parallel back to chapter 2 and, in their pursuit stage of one another. But there's a major advance. This time, rather than Solomon initiating the relationship and the pursuit in chapter 2, it's going to be Shulamite this time that is initiating here in chapter 7. And what we're going to see is that this scene is basically getting back to the basics. They're going to renew their pursuit stage of one another. And what do I mean by that? Well, don't forget the first couple lectures that we had. Primarily, I think the second lecture. We talked through the 5 love languages, how you show and demonstrate love in your relationships, how you show affection to your spouse. And that is so easy and natural when you first meet, because you're infatuated with each other. You're attracted to each other. You have that puppy love stage. And you're like, oh, this is so much fun. And you're writing love letters to all this, do you remember that stage? And it's so easy. And you're putting in the time and the effort. And then you're trying to win the heart of your spouse. But what happens is that once we win the heart of our spouse, we get married, then we're like, especially us guys, we can be guilty of this. We're hunters, right? We're not shoppers, we're hunters. We don't go into a store and just, window shop. Nope, we have a plan of action. I gotta go to that aisle, gotta get this, hunt it down, find it, get out. We're hunters. That's our nature. Well, we do the same thing in our love lives. We're on the prowl. We find our woman. We work to win her heart. And then, hey, it's over. I got her. And we stop. We stop pursuing our spouse. And our wives, our poor wives, sit there and they scratch their head and they're like, wait a minute, this guy was so romantic. This guy was so thoughtful. This guy was so nice. He was so funny. He had goals in life. And then we got married. And he stopped being all of those things. And she's like, wow, he's no longer the guy that I married and fell in love with. And so as a result, it's like they really have a hard time. And it causes a lot of discontentment in the marriage and frustration and hardship. But so much of it goes back to this idea is we stop pursuing each other. We got to keep it up. All right, so follow along. Chapter 7, verse 11. All right, Shulamite speaks. Come, my beloved, let us go forth into the field. Let us lodge in the villages. Let us get up early to the vineyards. Let us see if the vine flourish, whether the tender grape appear and the pomegranates bud forth. There will I give you my loves. The mandrakes give a smell, and at our gates are all manner of pleasant fruits, new and old, which I have laid up for you, O my beloved. Oh, look at chapter 8, verse 1. Oh, that you were as my brother, that sucked at the breasts of my mother. When I should find you without, I would kiss you, yea, I would not be despised. I would lead you and bring you into my mother's house, who would instruct me, who would cause you to drink of spiced wine of the juice of my pomegranate. His left hand should be under my head, and his right hand should embrace me. And then notice the chorus. It breaks the section. Shows us there's a section break. Verse 4. I charge you, O daughters of Jerusalem, that you stir not up, nor awake my love till he please. Okay, don't miss the significance of this section. In verse 11 and 12, Shulamite speaks, and she initiates. She says, hey, Solomon, let's go on a trip. Let's get out of town. Let's go do something together. She says, let us go forth into the field and lodge in the villages. In other words, let's get out of the city. Where they live, Jerusalem. It's the capital city. It's where Solomon is busy. He's about the business of the kingdom. And she says, you know what? We need time. To do what? Verse 12, let us get up early and go to the vineyards to see if the vine flourish, whether the tender grape appear, and the pomegranates bud forth. Don't miss. Don't forget. That is an idiom for inspecting the relationship. Remember? All the way back in chapter 2, when he says, hey, let's get married. Why? What was his reason why they should get married? Because he says, the winter is past, right? The rain is over and gone. The flowers appear on the earth. And our vine is budding. Our relationship has potential. And she says, yeah, it does. Well, chapter 6, same thing, where it talks about verse 11. Remember this? This was our session last time. She says, I went down to the vineyard of nuts to see the fruits of the valley, to see whether the vine flourished and the pomegranates budded. She was inspecting the relationship. Well, now she wants to do it again. Guys, remember, this is the way women work. They want to know the relationship is secure, that it is steady, that it's stable. And so she says, you know what, let's invest in our relationship. Let's take time to just be with each other. Let's get away from the busyness that we're struggling with. Let's get away. Let's go on a vacation and let's spend time as a couple. And notice how she has some rather fascinating things planned for him. She says, let's go to the field, lodge in the villages. Let's get up early to the vineyard, see if our vine flourishes. Let's check on our relationship. Let's invest in our relationship. And she says, there, into verse 12, will I give you my loves. In fact, she says, the mandrakes give a good smell. Y'all know what a mandrake is? In antiquity, in the ancient world, mandrakes, it's a type of herb, and it was believed to be an aphrodisiac and a fertility treatment. In other words, I think she has babies on her mind. I think she's wanting to get pregnant. I think she's wanting to get alone with Solomon, and she's kind of got the hots for Solomon right now. You know what I'm saying? That's what's going on. But get this, here's the big difference between what we saw thus far in the book and what we're seeing right now. If you read the book very carefully, just go back through the book, peruse it, you will discover that this scene in chapter 7, verses 11 and 12 here, and 13, this is the first time Shulamite is initiating a sexual encounter. Interesting. Not only does that signal, I think, the natural occurrence that many marriages have this in common. I think marriages that I've talked to, often, the woman is wanting kids before the man. And I think that's definitely part of what's going on here. And so she's like, all right, let's get busy. I want kids. Because I think that's also alluded to later in chapter 8. But I think it also highlights this idea that this is the first time that she feels secure enough in the relationship that she is initiating sex. This is so common, right? I mean, I hear this in every single couple, almost. I mean, there's exceptions, one or two, but not many. Almost every couple I talk to, the man initiates the majority of sexual encounters, right? I mean, we're just wired that way. God built us that way. The man is kind of, we want sex more often than our wives do. And so we initiate sex. But when the wife initiates sex, she's either on her period, the window before and after the period where she's ovulating, or the woman is just feeling incredibly emotionally secure. It's amazing to me. Because don't forget the scene that we just ended on. Last time we talked through this. But in verse 10, after they kiss and make up, after their fight, Shulamite expresses the highest level of emotional security thus far in the book when she says, I am my beloved's, and his desire is toward me. That's verse 10, chapter 7, verse 10. Remember talking about that? Now, that emotional security, that emotional warmth that she feels between her and her husband is turning her on. I mean, she is like, oh man, I feel so safe in this relationship. I love my husband so much. And she says, hey, I'm going to plan to get away. And let me just tell you, guys, when we treat our women that way, and they do feel that emotional security, it's amazing how they respond emotionally and sexually. And, well, let me just say, women, guys love that. Oh, man. Because guys are the ones that 90% of the time are initiating sex. When you initiate sex as a wife, oh boy, there's something exciting about that. It's a good thing. Let me just tell you. Guys, would you agree with me? Look at your wife. Nod at her right now. Yes, it's a wonderful thing. And she is initiating. She is planning. She says, hey, I am going to give you my loves. She's planning for a positive sexual encounter. She says, I'm going to spice it up a little bit. I'm going to bring mandrakes, which was considered an aphrodisiac, to spice up the sex life a little bit. And she says, I'm going to bring out all manner of pleasant fruits, new and old, she says, which I have laid up for you. I've prepared. Now, some scholars go back and forth on that, but most of them believe that is a reference to their, next sexual encounter. That she's like, hey, I'm going to treat you to something new that you haven't seen before, in the bedroom. And, let me just tell you, ladies, guys love it when you buy a new set of lingerie or you do something to spice up the sex life. You do something to take some initiative there. Guys love it. And guys, am I right? Yeah. The point is, it is a great way to pursue your husband. It really is. It's a great way to pursue your husband. And husband, I often, pick on you for stopping the pursuit. You stop, showing the 5 love languages to your wife. You stop showering her with, words of affirmation and acts of service. Remember these? All right, can you list them off? The 5 love languages. You should be able to say these in your sleep. I encourage you, memorize them. Number 1, words of affirmation. Say, I love you. Number 2, acts of service. Right? Wash the dishes. Mow the lawn. Play with the kids. Do something where you are showing your wife how much you love her and value her. Number 3, give her gifts. Gift giving. My wife really likes that one. Give her gifts. Quality time. Number 4. Just spend time with her. You know what I'm saying? Be able to remember chapter 1, and boy, I don't need to take the time to rehearse all this, but do you remember chapter 1 where she says, "Hey, tell me, where do you feed your flocks at noon?" Chapter 1, verse 7. She wants time with him. And then number 5, physical touch. The 5th love language, physical touch. The point is, guys, hold her hand. Give her a hug. Give her a kiss. Even apart from sexuality, just give her an affectionate embrace. That's what she's actually longing for. Back, in chapter 8, verse 3, she says, "His left hand is under my head, his right hand doth embrace me." He's just holding me. That's great. Guys, shower your wife with affection. Wife, shower your husband with respect, as we talked about last time, and pursue him. Even sexually, pursue your husband. It's amazing the dividends that pays in a marriage, because the husband, is less tempted to be looking elsewhere, struggling with pornography, thinking, fantasizing in his mind. He's going to struggle with that less when you are so active towards him. Boy, it's really helpful. Read 1 Corinthians 7 sometime. It's a very helpful principle to be sexually active and engaging one another, both of you pursuing each other. But let's face it, sometimes work, responsibilities, kids, they get in the way of a healthy sex life. So get away. Have a time to where you're going and you're getting alone and you're just investing time with each other. It started becoming a joke in my family that every time we had an anniversary, because I would typically plan a getaway for our anniversary, where my wife and I we'd find somebody to watch the kids, and we're off, and we're going to go have a night in Salt Lake or a night over in Twin Falls, or we're just going to go out of town. We're just going to get together alone, spend some time together, and it was kind of the running joke that 9 months later we have another kid, because and it's true. Sometimes it's hard to have a healthy sex life in the middle of responsibility and busyness. And I mean, I'm working like a dog all week long, and I come home at night and I'm tired. And sometimes we're snuggling on the couch and I fall asleep before we finish watching a movie. And or my wife, she's been running around all day chasing kids, and she's exhausted and she's falling asleep, or whatever. The point is, it can be very difficult to pursue one another amidst the responsibilities of life. But we need to take time outs where we purposefully go to invest in our relationship. We renew our pursuit. We continue our pursuit of one another. We put each other as a priority. Prioritize your relationship. Don't set it down backseat. Particularly if through these last six sessions, and here we are at the 7th session, but if through this course you have started making progress in your relationship, you're actually talking, you're actually starting to renew, kind of rekindle a relationship together. You're starting to make progress. Don't stop. Don't put that on the back burner. Keep going. Build on this progress. And one of the best ways is to plan a getaway. Go somewhere, away, alone. Get somebody to watch the kids if you have them. Take some time off work. Get alone with each other and invest in each other. And as she says in chapter 8, verse 1, "Oh, that you were as a brother that sucked from the breasts of my mother. When I should find you without, I would kiss you and not be despised." Now, that might sound a little weird, but what is she talking about? In ancient world, even to the modern day, in this area of the world, in the Near East, public displays of affection are taboo. You do not show public displays of affection to your spouse. You just don't do it. It's not considered polite in public. So what she's longing for there is she's basically saying, I wish you were my brother, because then I could show you affection in public and I wouldn't be despised for it. The point is, public displays of affection were considered taboo, still are in many parts of the world, to your spouse. But it was considered okay if you were family. Like a brother could hug his sister or kiss his sister. That was considered okay. And so what she's basically saying here is she is so up and wanting to show affection towards Solomon. She's like, oh, but I'm holding myself back, that here we are in public and I can't be kissing you like I want to be. And so but she says, if only you were like my brother, then we could have these public displays of affection. The point is, she's trying to communicate to him how much she is longing to show affection to him at this moment. Verse 2, she says, because if I could, I would lead you and bring you into my mother's house, who would instruct me, and I would cause you to drink of the spice wine and the juice of my pomegranate. And again, what she's probably getting at there in verse 2 is the idea of having, yes, a private sexual encounter, but also she's probably talking about kids. She's probably wanting for her mother to instruct her. Right? Why? Well, because Shulamite wants to learn how to be a mom. She wants to learn how to be a mother to children. And so, again, she's probably, in the context here, she's probably talking about kids. And that brings up another whole issue that we could spend another whole course on, is the idea of parenting. And parenting is, we'll see a little bit more of it here in a minute, down later in chapter 8, some other principles that we can learn and glean from. But the reality is, this is an important part of marriage, is because if you have kids, then kids become, number one, a huge responsibility, an important responsibility, a God-given responsibility. I mean, do not neglect your responsibility as a parent. But number two, it can bring stress on a relationship. I get it. I got 6 kids. I get the fact that it can be very difficult to invest in your relationship, your marriage, when you have a lot of kids. Or kids in general, just kids, period. And so it does, you need to be on the same page there. And sometimes it's a source of frustration in a marriage. You can't have kids, and it's a strain on a relationship. Or maybe you have one spouse wants 1 kid or 2, and the other spouse wants 5 or 6. And, so you got to come to an agreement on how many, when are we going to have kids, how far apart, how are we going to raise them, are we going to discipline them, how are we going to discipline them, are we going to get them involved in church, and all these questions. You got to sit down, you got to communicate, you got to work through that. And that's clearly on Shulamite's mind. But that may be part of the reason she wants to do a getaway. Is she says, hey, let's go invest in our relationship. Let's talk about this. I got to get you alone. I want to talk about kids. And we need to do that. We need to talk through these issues. Well, talk through these things so they don't become issues. We need to be on the same page. But as I said before, chapter 8, verse 4 that's the 5th and final chorus through the book, that common refrain that we've seen now 5 times through the book, when she says, I charge you, O daughters of Jerusalem, that you stir not up nor arouse love until he pleases her, until the time is right. We've already talked about the significance of that, but the point is, it breaks. It shows us another section break in the song. Because, right, you have stanza, chorus, stanza, chorus, stanza, chorus. Well, here's our chorus. Now we have our final stanza. And what I want you to see in this final stanza, in verses 5 to 14, we're going to end the book. This is what we're going to see. I head this section with the title, Resting in Acceptance. Resting in Acceptance. Because after they have been on their getaway, and they have enjoyed one another, and they've gotten out of the city, and they've been alone for a while, now they're coming back to Jerusalem. And in verse 5, it says that, this is the daughters of Jerusalem speaking in verse 5. Listen to this. They say, who is this that comes up from the wilderness, leaning upon her beloved? It's parallel to what we saw earlier in chapter 3, verse 6, for instance, when they were coming up, the entourage, when Solomon and Shulamite were returning from Lebanon and coming up to Jerusalem, for the wedding. Remember that? The entourage where he went and retrieved her and brought her to Jerusalem. Well, now they're coming back to Jerusalem, and there's an entourage, perhaps, or maybe the entourage isn't explicit. Maybe they just went away by themselves. That's probably actually what happened. But the daughters of Jerusalem, now seeing them return, say, "Hey, who is this that's coming up out of the wilderness, leaning upon her beloved?" I want to draw special attention to that phrase. The point is, when Solomon and Shulamite are returning from their getaway, it apparently was a very good getaway. And it was healthy for the relationship. Why? Because as they're coming back, we see a very good display of healthy body language. Her Shulamite is leaning upon her beloved. And the daughters of Jerusalem note that. They say, "Wow, who is this? Oh, wow, look, she's leaning upon her beloved," as they're coming back into the city. And the point is, that's where I get the title for this section, Resting in Acceptance. Is this getaway was so good and so positive, and they made some really good progress in their marriage, and they've made those investments in their marriage, that it's resulting in a really positive relationship where they are leaning on one another. They're resting on one another. And it's almost the picture that she's, leaning on him, maybe fell asleep on his shoulder, maybe something along those lines. The point is, it's a beautiful picture of her trust in him, her reliance on him, her love for him. She's accepted by him, and she's resting in that acceptance. That's the point. All right? And so that's really the heading for the rest of the section. But she says, "Who is this that comes up from the wilderness leaning upon her beloved?" Now Shulamite speaks, "I raised thee up under the apple tree. There thy mother brought thee forth. There she brought thee forth that bare thee." And she's probably reporting on the getaway, that she aroused Solomon when she says, "I raised thee up under the apple tree." Again, the apple tree there is parallels back to the way she described Solomon back in chapter 2. Remember, he's like an apple tree amongst the trees of the wood. But then she says, "I raised thee up" there. And some translations get it better when it says, "I aroused thee." It's probably talking about a sexual encounter that they had. They're investing in their relationship. It was a good getaway, right? It was fun, well planned, relaxing, lots of good sex. It was just a good time, right? Now they're coming back. And she says, "I raised thee up under the apple tree. There your mother brought you forth. There she brought thee forth that bare thee." Those sentences, again, give us a clue, because in antiquity, it was kind of believed. It was almost like an old wives' fable, that if you could be more fertile and you had better chance to conceive if you went to the place where you yourself were conceived. So that's the idea of going to the place where your mother brought you forth. In other words, I think she's trying to have a baby. I think that's exactly what's going on. And she's trying to get pregnant, and so she's going to the very place where Solomon was conceived and where she was conceived, because they were just at her mother's house. It's up here in verse 2 it mentions. And so, again, that's probably what's going on there, is she's trying to get pregnant. But it's going well, and maybe she's gotten pregnant. But then in verses 6 and 7, she erupts into this hymn on love. I'm going to talk about it a little bit more in a second. It's really a pretty high point in the book, where it's talking about the nature of love. And it's one of the most beautiful portions of the book, very poetic. We'll look at that in a second. But then what we'll see in verses 8 to 12, Shulamite is going to review the past. She's going to get a little reminiscent on her own childhood. And we'll see that when we get there. And is probably due to the fact that she is pregnant. She is perhaps expecting a child. And so she's thinking back on her own childhood. She's thinking about her life experience, and she's thinking about raising that child. But then the book will end in a very fascinating way, verses 13 and 14, where they actually have to separate for a time. Apparently he's off on a business trip or something. And the book ends with them apart, but longing to reunite, awaiting reunion. And there's some really interesting practical stuff to see there. All right? But let's just focus for a few moments on the big ideas of this section. I want you to see that, number one, this section serves to climax and summarize the whole book. This section in verses 5 to 14 summarizes all the key ideas. Many of the key characters in the book reappear in this section, and it serves to somewhat summarize the book at large. And it portrays, as I mentioned a moment ago, with that phrase, leaning upon her beloved, it portrays marital security at its best, that they are resting in one another's love. That's where we want to get in our marriages. And so let's watch how this develops. Now, I already explained verse 5, but let's talk about that hymn of love in verses 6 and 7. Look at this. She says, Shulamite speaking, "Set me as a seal upon your heart, as a seal upon your arm, for love is strong as death, jealousy is cruel as the grave. The coals thereof are coals of fire, which hath a most vehement flame. Many waters cannot quench love, neither can the floods drown it. If a man would give all the substance of his house for love, it would utterly be condemned or despised or looked down upon." Now, with this, it's beautiful poetic language, and we could really spend a lot of time developing it. I encourage your further study on this personally. But what I want you to see is the three big ideas that come out of these two verses in how she describes the nature of love. And it's beautiful because it's coming to the end of the book, and it's after they have gone through so much of their marriage experience up to this point. And these are some of the big lessons that she's learned. And she wants to encapsulate them for us and kind of give us the big ideas that she's learned on the nature of love, marital love. And number one, she says, she likens love to a seal. And a seal is, again, not the barking, marine animal. No. Seal as in what they would do to seal letters. And the idea is, recall, if and we do it today, we seal an envelope and we put a stamp on it and then we mail it. And the idea is it's meant to show ownership. It's meant to show who it's from, who it's going to, and it's a federal crime to open someone else's mail because it's sealed and it's meant to be protected. Well, in a similar way, they sealed mail and official documents in the ancient world. The king himself would have had an official seal that would have been the king's seal. We found dozens of these in Israel and through archaeology. Boy, I'm going to try not to get lost in that. But the big idea behind likening love to a seal is the idea of protection. That love by nature is protective. It's exclusive. She says, "Set me as a seal upon your heart and upon your arm." In other words, she says, love is protective. She says, "You're mine. Let me be the seal on your heart." In other words, don't love anybody else the way that you love me. Put me as a seal upon your heart. Don't let anyone else into your heart, just me. And the idea is love by its very nature is protective. It's exclusive. Genuine marital love needs to be protective. And it's kind of fun, but I think of stories back in my own, my wife and our dating stage when I was in college. This was before we were actually married, but I was getting pretty serious about her. I really liked her. And I knew this was the one. I really didn't have any doubt in my mind. And I wanted to ask her to one of their, the school events, and she was going to be my date, and, it was going to be a special night. Well, there was this guy named Travis, and he was, and if you're listening to this, Travis, if you ever stumble upon this, then, I'm sorry, I'm telling you a story, or telling a story on you. Travis was this little twerp. He was like a skinny little beanpole, and he decided, he had the guts, the gall, to come and ask she wasn't exclusively mine, but we were dating and everybody knew it. And Travis tried to swoop in and ask her to this event as his date and take her from me. How do you think I handled that? Not so well. I did actually restrain myself. I did not punch him in the face, but I really wanted to. I just about unleashed on this guy. I'm like, who do you think you are? Swooping in here, trying to take my woman. You know what I'm saying? Well, my wife, my wife now, she wasn't the wife then. She was my, we were just dating at the time. She loved my reaction. The fact that I was protective over her. I said, no, Travis, beat it. Get out of here, you little twerp. I'm going to kill you if you try this again. The reality is, she loved the fact that I was protective over her because it showed her how much I loved her, that I really did uh, view our relationship as exclusive. I wasn't going to let anybody in on this relationship. I mean, it's her and I, and that's it. Nobody else is in. And even to this day, I mean, somebody tries, especially to this day, somebody tries to hit on my wife. Oh boy, you just better pray I don't have a loaded gun anywhere present. You know, the reality is, I'm protective of my wife, and she's protective of me, and I love that. I love that about my wife, and love should be that way. But secondly, love is not only protective; it's powerful. She likens here the true love to two things: the grave and fire. Now, it sounds a little strange to liken love to death and the grave, but the point is, death and the grave are irresistible. We're all going to die, and we're all going to be in the grave at some point. The idea is that it is an overwhelmingly powerful force. Death is. We can't escape it. And so when you think of it that way, it's actually pretty profound. That love is powerful. Like death or the grave, it's overwhelming in its force. And it's really kind of a cool thing. But not only does she liken it to death and the grave, but also to a fire. Now, this is a powerful idea. But she says that fire, love is like fire. She says it's like, end of verse 6, coals thereof are as coals of fire, which hath a most vehement flame. In other words, she mentions three stages there, like a hot coal. Love starts kind of with just a spark, doesn't it? Just a hot coal, a spark, a little source of heat. But then once you fan that flame, or that coal a little bit, then it bursts into flame. That's the next phrase. She says not only coals, but coals of fire. A spark or a coal that leads to a flame. But if you continue to stoke that love, and you protect that love, and you feed that fire, what happens? It grows into a vehement flame, a burning, raging inferno. And that's what true love is like. It can be a powerful force. But just like fire, if we neglect it, if we don't feed it, if we don't protect it, it can diminish in power. So that's a pretty profound, word picture. But then she also says that love is priceless. It can't be bought. She says here that when if a man were to give all the substance of his house for love, it would utterly be condemned. In other words, true love is voluntary. You can't buy it off. You can't force it. It has to be given. It can't be purchased. True love is priceless. It's the most valuable thing you will ever have. And that's why I encourage you, and I applaud you. If you've made it this far in the marriage course, then here you are. You're trying to save your marriage. And my friends, you might have a marriage that are back to coals in your relationship. And you barely got a spark left. I mean, you're almost to the end. But I encourage you, build that flame back up. You can rekindle it. You can go back. You can repair your relationship. You can restore, using these principles that we've worked through. You can restore your relationship. And so much so that she says, again, look at verse 6, coals of fire, most vehement flame. That verse 7, many waters can't quench and floods can't drown it. You can get your marriage back to a place of a raging inferno, a vehement flame that can't be put out. It can't be drowned. And if you do that, if you put the work into coming back and restoring your marriage, it will be the greatest thing you have ever done. It is priceless. It will be the most valuable thing in your entire life. That's what God says. Please, just believe it. I encourage you, stay faithful. Keep encouraging one another and pursuing that love relationship. But what happens next in verses 8 to 12 is, again, I already said, probably because, I'm kind of conjecturing here, but possibly because Shulamite's pregnant and she's got baby brain. But verses 8 to 12, she begins to reminisce. She starts thinking about the past. And what you're going to see, big picture here, you can see on the screen, is, first of all, Shulamite has a new perspective. She's going to, in verses 8 to 10 there, she's going to reveal the fact that she has a new perspective on her past. We'll contrast it with the way she likened it back in chapter 1. But in chapter 1, she did not have a very fond view of her brothers or her upbringing. But now she does. And she has gratitude instead of bitterness. And we'll talk about that. And then verses 11 and 12, Shulamite has a new resolve in her present. So number 1, she has a new perspective on her past. And then number 2, she has a new resolve in her present. That she's not only full of gratitude for the past, but she is resolved to be showing honor in the present. Okay, let's look at it. Verse 8 says, "We have a little sister, and she hath no breasts. What shall we do for our sister in the day when she shall be spoken for? If she be a wall, we will build up upon her a palace of silver. If she be a door, we will enclose her with boards of cedar." Now, in verse 8 and 9, again, it seems a little drastic. You're like, wait, well, that's quite the change of subject. But again, it's a song. I told you, this is kind of the way the poetry is written. Who's talking in verses 8 and 9? It is Shulamite's brothers. Remember, they were introduced back in chapter 1. Let's go back there just quickly. Chapter 1, remember her first visit to Jerusalem when Shulamite was coming into the city? And she says to the daughters of Jerusalem, "I'm black, but comely, O you daughters of Jerusalem." And then she says in verse 6, "Look not upon me because I am black, I'm tan, I'm scorched, because the sun has looked upon me, because my mother's children," which we find out are brothers, plural, we don't know how many, but at least 2. She says, "My mother's children were angry with me. They made me the keeper of the vineyards, but my own vineyard have I not kept." In other words, the first time we're introduced to her brothers in chapter 1, it's not, she does not have a fond memory. She's tan, and she feels insecure about that because, recall, it evidences that she is from the peasant class. So she says, "You know what, I'm tan, I'm dark, but the reason she's defending herself is because my mother's children," which is a rather distant way of referring to your siblings, "my mother's children were angry with me. They made me the keeper of the vineyard. They forced me out into the vineyards." And she says, "But so my own vineyard," referencing her body, "I have not kept." In other words, I didn't have time to primp and pamper myself because I was working out hard. I was working hard out in the fields. And I was working out there because my brothers made me do it. Well, in chapter 1, she doesn't seem all that fond of that memory. Chapter 8 now, she is totally changing gears. She has a new perspective on why her brothers made her work out in the vineyard. She rehearses a conversation that her brothers had in verses 8 and 9 when she was very young. That's the point of verse 8 when it says, "We have a little sister and she hath no breasts." The point is, her brothers are talking about her when she is pre-puberty. And the point is, apparently, her father is not around. Her father must have died, or something happened, but he's not around. And her brothers are taking the lead in raising their younger sister. And they're thinking ahead. They're saying, okay, right now she's young. She has no breasts. She's pre-puberty. But they say, what shall we do for our sister in the day that she will be spoken for? Now, spoken for is an idiom. The day of being spoken for is an idiom for marriage, right? The day that she will be betrothed. In other words, they're looking at her as a young girl and they say, you know what? She's going to grow up fast. And when she grows up, someday, the day is coming, that someone is going to come and ask for her hand in marriage. So how are we as brothers, as the male authority in her life, how are we going to protect her, provide for her, raise her, and prepare her for marriage? Wow. This is a fabulous lesson, by the way, in how we as parents, because again, they're brothers, but apparently they're doing what the parent would have done, is they are thinking about her future. They're thinking about her character. They're thinking about how to preserve, particularly in this context, preserve her sexual purity. They want to make sure she's a virgin when she gets married. They want to protect her and preserve her as a virgin. And they're thinking about this before she even hits puberty. I don't know about you, but that gives me a lot of insight into how and when I should be talking to my kids about the birds and the bees. I need to be thinking, how am I going to talk to them about sex about purity, about virginity? How am I going to preserve them and protect them and provide for them so that they, and raise them so that they can be prepared for their future marriage? Well, notice verse 9. This is what they decide to do. If she be a wall, we'll build upon her a palace of silver. If she be a door, we will enclose her with boards of cedar. Now, it's a poetic way of describing it, but it's pretty apparent what's going on. If she be a wall, meaning if she has character, that she will not accept the advances, the sexual advances of young men. In other words, she has the character to say no, to do what's right, to preserve her own virginity. If she is a wall with strong character, then we will build upon her a palace of silver. We're just going to reinforce that, and we are going to reward that with silver. In other words, they're going to reward good character. But if she be a door, rather than having a character of her own, maybe she's going to be, a little loose, a loose sort of woman, and she can't handle the advances of other men, and she's a bit of a door. She wants to let them right in. Then they say, what are we going to do if she doesn't have strength of character? Then we will enclose her with boards of cedar. And the idea is we're going to do what we have to put boundaries up in her life. Now, what's fascinating is we can't, say this for sure, but it makes you wonder, is this then the answer to why, according to chapter 1, verse 6, her mother's children made her the keeper of the vineyard? They sent her out into the field? Maybe. Were they? Might I suggest that the brothers were actually thinking ahead and they were actually trying to protect her and preserve her virginity? So they put her to work, they taught her good work ethics, and they isolated her out in the field to where she was going to have fewer male interactions with the wrong kind of guys. I think that's possible. I don't know about you, but I got daughters, and I am going to know every man who comes into their life. And if there is some wolf in sheep's clothing, if there's some guy who all he wants is premarital sex out of my daughter, I'm going to kill that kid. Okay, maybe not kill him, but I am going to be sure, dead sure, of the men that are in my daughter's lives. I'm already talking to my girls right now about being pure and being careful to not be alone in the room with some other guy. That and I mean, I'm telling the brothers, their brothers, my sons, to protect my girls and say, hey, you treat them nice. You don't let somebody else pick on your sisters. Don't let somebody else some other boy be alone with your sisters. You protect your women. You ask my son Keith, and you say, hey, what do men do for their women? And he'll say, we protect our women. I've drilled that into him. And that's the point I want him to have. I want him to do what these brothers did for her. Well, look at verse 10. So verse 8 and 9 is Shulamite thinking back on her childhood. Now verse 10, she says, I am a wall, and my breasts are like towers. Then was I in his eyes as one that found favor. Solomon had a vineyard at Baal Hamon. He let out the vineyard unto keepers. Every one for the fruit thereof was to bring 1,000 pieces of silver. My vineyard, which is mine, is before me. Thou, O Solomon, must have 1,000, and those that keep the fruit thereof 200. What's going on in these verses? Okay, so verse 8 and 9 gave you the insight into the life, her early childhood and the brothers and how they were going to help raise their sister. Well, now, verse 10, she reports. In the present now, she's married to Solomon. She says, okay, I'm a wall. In other words, what was she? Her brothers were thinking, okay, if she's a wall, then we're going to reward her. If she's a door, we're going to enclose her. Either way, we're going to protect her virginity, and we're going to prepare her for marriage. Well, now, as a married woman, looking back, she says, I was a wall. I maintained my virginity. I was pure and ready and prepared for marriage. And she says, now my breasts are like towers. And the idea is she's talking about she is full-grown woman, mature, and she's married. And she says, then was I in his eyes. Whose? Solomon's. Then was I in his eyes as one that found favor. Now, we already talked about that verse, but the word favor in Hebrew is shalom, and it's a word play. It's translated peace sometimes in some translations, but it's a word play because remember, Solomon, his name, Shlomo, means the peaceable one. The name of the woman, Shulamite, also means the same thing. It's just the feminine form in Hebrew. So there's a pun here going on. Is Shulamite meets Shlomo, Solomon, and they have shalom. They have peace. But here's the point. She is thankful that her brothers, preserved her purity, because now she tells the story of how she met Solomon. And she says in verse 11 that Solomon had a vineyard at Baal Hamon, and he let out the vineyard to the keepers. So we already talked about this all the way back in the introduction, but this is where we get it. Solomon is king. He owns vineyards all over, assumedly all over Israel, but he owns some at Baal Hamon. And this is where she lived. Solomon's the owner. He lent out the vineyard to keepers. So that, again, don't forget the concept. But Solomon's the owner, but he's not working the vineyard. He hires a family to do it. Apparently, Shulamite's family they're the people working the vineyard. And so their job is to work the vineyard, to produce the fruit. When the fruit comes in and they make the wine, etc., then they were to bring 1,000 pieces of silver to Solomon. In other words, we still do this today. I had a grandpa that used to own a lot of farmland in Illinois. But he got to an age that he couldn't work the land anymore. He was too old. And so rather than working the land, he leased the land. He leased it out to farmers who worked it. And then they would pay my grandpa a portion of the crops, and then they would keep the rest. And that's exactly what's going on here. Solomon's the owner, but he's leasing it out to the vineyard keepers. And Solomon's supposed to get 1,000 pieces of silver for the deal, but then they get to keep whatever is left over. And so the point is that she was one of those vineyard hands working the fields. And yet, that's apparently where they met. Solomon comes to inspect the vineyard. He meets her, and he is smitten. Oh, my word, is she gorgeous. And he starts courting her, and he starts pursuing her. And what's fascinating is that as this happens, he is attracted to her, and she is a virgin. She is, in ancient world, in Israel, there was always a bride price. That when you wanted to court someone or marry someone, then there was a bride price involved. And Solomon, undoubtedly, for him to pay the bride price for Shulamite, that would have gone to her brothers. It would have been the father, but unless, apparently he's dead. But the bride price, if the woman is not a virgin, the bride price plummets. She is not as valuable. Again, I know that might sound weird to you, modern Western culture, but this is the way it worked in ancient world. And not just the ancient world, it still exists today in many parts of the world. I had a lady, or a friend one time, she was a girl, that I worked with at camp when I was in high school, and she used to laugh because she went on a tour to, it's a mission trip, to Africa. And she was a white girl, and in the middle of Africa, and multiple times, some of these African chieftains and men in the village would come up and offer a bride price for her. And they kept offering, like she said, the best price she ever got was 2 goats and a chicken. In other words, these Africans were ready to pay 2 goats and a chicken for this girl, this white girl, because she was very valuable. She was very unique. She was the only white girl in the whole area. But the whole point is, it was kind of funny, but it still works this way in parts of the world. That's my point. And in antiquity, if a virgin would fetch a good price. A beautiful virgin would fetch a really good bride price. And she realizes now, in retrospect, that she was valuable, and she was pure, and she was beautiful enough that she caught the eyes of the king. And King Solomon came and made her his wife. And she who once resented her brothers in how they treated her when she was growing up, now she realizes, Oh my word, I am now the queen of Israel. I have married the king. And so she realizes, verse 12, she says, my vineyard, which is mine. It's a reference to her body, her virginity, her character. She says, my vineyard, which is mine, is before me. Thou, O Solomon, must have 1,000, but those who keep the fruit thereof 200. Do you see what she's doing there? She says, not only were my brothers good keepers of a literal vineyard, that they worked that vineyard, had lots of grapes, lots of wine, gave to Solomon 1,000 pieces, that was rightfully his, and then they got the rest. She says that is not only true of the physical vineyard, but it is true of the metaphorical vineyard. It's true of their sister. See, her brothers were not only good keepers of a physical vineyard, they were good keepers of their sister. They raised her. They treated her well. They protected her. They prepared her for marriage. And she says, you know what, Solomon, you have me. I'm now yours. He owns, just like he owned the literal vineyard, he now is married to Shulamite. And he owns Shulamite as a vineyard, the metaphorical vineyard. She says, my vineyard, which I couldn't keep back in chapter 1, right? I was dark but comely. She says, now I have given myself to Solomon. But she says, guess what? My brothers deserve some credit for that. Just like my brothers would give, 1,000 pieces of silver of the income of the vineyard to Solomon, but they would keep 200. She said, now they give her, the brothers, give their sister to Solomon in marriage, and they get the bride price back. In other words, she recognizes that credit needs to go where credit's due. She recognizes her brothers did something good in protecting her and preparing her for marriage, and now she realizes it. And just a quick thought on that. I think it's not only fascinating insight into how we can raise our own kids, but secondly, I think she's growing up. Shulamite has developed emotionally and spiritually to the point that she realizes that her brothers need to be honored, that she needs to honor those who prepared her for marriage. And that is showing that she's not a spoiled little brat anymore. She is grown into womanhood. She realizes the debt that she owes to her brothers. And that would be true of us. Maybe not your older brothers, but maybe it was your parents. Whoever it is that raised you, what good qualities do you have? And whom do you owe that to? I would not be the person I am today without my parents. I have a set of godly parents, praise God. And I owe them an immense debt of gratitude. And I need to honor them. And that's what Shulamite learned. It's a powerful concept. All right, we have arrived to the last 2 verses of the book. Are you ready? Verse 13 and 14. Thou that dwellest in the gardens, the companions hearken to your voice, cause me to hear it. Make haste, my beloved, and be thou like a roe or a young hart upon the mountains of spices. This is a wonderful way to end the book. Let me just explain it to you, then we'll be done. Verse 13, Solomon is the speaker. Verse 14, Shulamite is the speaker. And it's a fascinating way to end the book because it parallels chapter 2 and verse 17. And yet, though it parallels chapter 2, verse 17, it's dramatically different. Because, remember this, back in chapter 2, after they got engaged, and betrothed is the correct word, they have to separate. She stays in Lebanon, he goes back to Jerusalem. And remember, they had to separate because of, that was the normal betrothal thing. They get betrothed, but in order to maintain purity in that relationship and not have sex outside of marriage, they would separate. He would go and prepare a place for her. He would then come, receive her unto himself, that where he is, there she will be also. And that idea of the way a Jewish wedding worked is referenced throughout the book. Well, in chapter 2, when they had to separate, she says, oh, hurry back. Remember that? Verse 17, she says, until the day break and the shadows flee away, return, my beloved, and be thou like a roe or a young hart upon the mountains of Bether. She says, I know we have to be apart for a time, but please hurry back. Please come back to me. And she was expressing her longing to be with Solomon. And she couldn't wait till he would come back, sweep her off her feet, bring her to the wedding, and they would live happily ever after. Well, Remember, right after she utters those words, she has the nightmare in chapter 3, verses 1 to 5. Remember this? She has the nightmare of losing Solomon, and it expresses her insecurity and her fear of losing Solomon. Now, fast forward to the end of the book. After they have gone through all the life experience up to this point, the marriage experience, the fight, the rebuilding, etc., their marriage is stronger for it. And they still, at the end of the book, I think it's a wonderful, clever way to end the book. At the end of the book, they have to separate. Why? The text doesn't say. We assume that Solomon has to leave, probably for some kingly duty, whatever. But he's gone. And they have to separate. But when they separate, she still, just like they had to separate all the way back in chapter 2, she still longs for him to return. She says, "Make haste, my beloved, be there like a roe or a young hart upon the mountains of spices." So she says, please come back just as soon as you can. They're longing to be together. And that's healthy, right? Sometimes, you got to separate. You're like, oh man, I need a vacation from my spouse, and I got to, when your spouse leaves and you go, man, life is way easier. That might be a signal that your marriage isn't where it should be. You know what I'm saying? But when you have to separate, and they're like, oh man, okay, I get it, we got to separate, but oh, please come back, hurry back, I want to be with you. That's an important thing, and it's a good sign that there is there's good chemistry in the relationship, and there's good security in the relationship. But one quick comment here, before I give you your homework assignment, is simply this. I think it's fascinating that in chapter 2, remember, she says, hurry upon the mountains of Bether. In other words, remember the Bether can be translated mountains of separation. The point is, the separation was painful, and she was insecure, and she feared losing him. But now, when they are forced to separate later in marriage, because let's face it, reality is, marriage, we still got to, embrace responsibility, do what we got to do. And there's times that marriage, we still got to, separate for whatever reason. Got to go on a business trip, got to do this, got to do that, got to go see family, got to go to this funeral, got to, whatever. And the reality is, marriage will bring times of hardship and separation. And, but this time that they're separated, she says, come upon the mountains of spices. In other words, their separation is not so bitter. Their separation is not so bitter. Why? Because in chapter 2, she was a mess. She was so insecure. She did not know that she had her husband's, her Solomon's love. They weren't even married yet. She wasn't sure he'd come back. She was fearful. She was insecure. But now, after they've gone through the marriage, and they've gone through some rocky roads, and they've had to rebuild, etc., etc., now notice, she's confident that though they have to separate for a time, he'll be back. He'll be back. Why? She knows that he loves her. She knows that he will come back because his desire is toward her. They have found shalom in the relationship. They have found peace and security, meaning, and happiness. Isn't that good? Isn't that a great way to end the book? And isn't that that's where we need to get in our relationships? To the point where we can rest securely in our marriage. I don't have to worry about my wife leaving me. I know she's going to stick with me. She doesn't worry that I'm going to leave her. Are we going to have issues? Are we going to have fights? We got to work through some things? Sure. That's going to happen in every marriage. But we can rest in security and await reunion. I know she's coming back, and she knows I'm coming back. And we can rest in that. Praise God. All right, here's your homework. Number 1, plan and participate in a getaway. I don't care who does it. You really should do it together, but obviously you go. But I mean, sit down and plan it together, okay? Say, hey, where should we go? When should we go? What should we do? In other words, I want you to do what we just read in chapter 7, verse 11 and following. Plan a getaway. Invest in your relationship. And this and when you go, whatever you end up doing, wherever you go, make this your goal. Number 2, investigate the state of your relationship. Just like Shulamite says, let's go to the vineyards. Let's investigate the state of our vineyards. Let's see how our relationship is doing. My friends, I want you to take me up on this. It doesn't have to be elaborate. I mean, it doesn't have to be a, $6,000 cruise, but it could just be a night away, 2 nights away, a weekend, whatever. Get alone with each other. Sit down as a couple and just talk. My friend, take your wife out to dinner. Wife, go buy something stinky for your husband. Go out to dinner. Enjoy some time alone in a hotel room all by yourself. Treat each other nice. Buy each other a little gift. Surprise each other. What the gift, take each other out to dinner and buy a gift and bring it to the dinner or bring it to whatever. Invest in each other. Talk. Investigate. Say, okay, how are we doing? I mean, we've gone through this marriage course. We've sat through this for 7 weeks. We've gone and done the homework, etc., etc. How are we doing? Are we listening to each other better than we were before? Do we love each other? Are we ready to save this marriage? Are we ready to pursue one another and to implement these principles? And are we ready? Are we willing? Ask each other those questions. Talk, communicate. Thirdly, I want you to understand and embrace the nature of true love. Just like Shulamite explained, the hymn on love. Love is protective. It is powerful. It's priceless. Please listen to me. It is worth it to save your marriage. With tears in my eyes, I just want to plead with you guys. Don't throw away the most precious thing that you have in this world. Your marriage, your love for one another is priceless. Don't throw it away. Be protective of it. Go, stoke that flame. Get that fire raging. Protect one another. Allow your love for one another to just be the most powerful force in your life. Please. And if you do that, then number 4, you will learn to rest in one another's love. You will learn the joy of marital stability and security. My friends, please take this seriously and live for the glory of God. Let's pray. Father, thank you for this blessed course. Thank you for the book of Song of Solomon. Thank you for your goodness and your grace. Thank you for how you have given to us what we need to know about life and marriage. I pray that, Lord, you would please work in a powerful way in my marriage, in the lives of those who have gone through this course, that you would give them the resolve to learn to do marriage your way. Help them to make it a lifelong pursuit, to read and study and review the principles of the Song of Songs. That, Lord, they would no longer be in an SOS, save our ship, distress situation in their marriage, but they would rather be an SOS following the Song of Songs and the principles that you have laid down here, that they would enjoy their marriages, learn to rebuild them, and to rest in one another's love. Father, please work your work in our lives for your glory and our good. In Christ's name, amen. Sure love you guys. I trust this has been a blessing to go through this course. Please feel free to reach out with any questions, comments, etc. I really care about you guys and your marriages. Please make the investments in your marriage. Follow God's ways and reap the fruit and the benefit. God bless.